Well, good morning. Good morning. Welcome in to Mishkan, Katan this morning. It has been a wild and crazy day over here, but that's all right. We are together. It's Wednesday morning at 11 a.m., and I am just delighted to have you here. As I promised last time we were together, we are going to be looking starting today at the book of Esther, and we are going to do it in what I hope will be for you today a fun way. I'm very excited about introducing the book, kicking it off like this for you today. So, let's just go ahead and let me tell you, I'm getting this weird message on my screen here. Hang on just a second. Let me see if I can figure out why this is doing this. Okay, I think it was something with my mouse. But we're going to do something that is done at the celebration called Purim in the spring, when the book of Esther is read and celebrated. And typically, the celebration of Purim, it's not one of the major festivals. It's not one of the festivals that our Father Yahweh declared and decreed in the book of Leviticus, because the story that is at the basis of Esther came along after the Lord instituted those Moedim. The celebration called Purim came along later, and a lot of Christians don't know what Purim is. They may have seen some reference to it on somebody's Facebook page or something of that nature, but generally, Christians don't know what Purim is. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about that this morning in introducing the book of Esther, introducing our study of it. And then we're going to do something fun. So let's talk about Purim a minute. So ultimately, the story of Esther is a story of God's deliverance of the Hebrew people, of the Israelite nation, when they were a nation within a nation. That is, when they were part of the Medo-Persian Empire. So, just a very brief, quick little history lesson. You know, when God brought his chosen people into the promised land under the leadership of Joshua, when that occurred, the Hebrew people began to populate the land, and they began to have their ups and downs with their God. They were at times quite obedient to his precepts and his principles and his mitzvot, his commandments that he gave to Moshe. And other times they were very disobedient. And so years rocked on, and about mid 500s BCE, the kingdom of Judah was hauled off to Babylon by King Nebuchadnezzar. And prior to that, the nation of Israel had split. They had split into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. And about 150 to 200 years before the Babylonians took the southern kingdom off to Babylon, the Assyrians had taken the northern kingdom, those 10 tribes, and just dispersed them all over the Assyrian Empire. So actually, the conquering of the northern kingdom by Assyria was the first major tragedy, which resulted from the apostasy of God's people. And Judah was feeling all high and mighty that wouldn't happen to them, but it did because of their apostasy. And they were hauled off to Babylon, most of them. The ones that were left were mostly the old and the infirm. In other words, people who really couldn't contribute much to Babylon. The Babylonians just let them go. So this was a sad 70 years. Well, after 70 years, the prophet Jeremiah had prophesied that the Babylonian captivity, as it was called, would only last for 70 years. And that is what happened. It only lasted for 70 years. And then the Medes and the Persians, under kings Darius and Cyrus, conquered the kingdom of Babylon and absorbed it into the Medo-Persian Empire. And the story of Esther takes place during the time that the Medes and the Persians still were in control of that area where the Jews had been hauled off to, basically what was formerly known as Babylon. And at the end of the 70 years of the Babylonian captivity, Darius and Cyrus, when they took over, they told the Jews they could go back to Judah. But the thing is that while a lot of them went, a lot of them did not go. A lot chose to remain there as part of the Medo-Persian Empire. They were happy there, they were doing well there, and they just decided to stay. And things rocked along until the reign of one of the major characters in our lesson today, and that was the king of the Medes and the Persians. And some think that this was more of a title than a name. But in Hebrew, and I got lessons from my Hebrew teacher on how to say his name in Hebrew. In English, we usually say something like Ahasuerus. It's got lots of syllables, okay? And there's not even total agreement about how to pronounce that. But in Hebrew, his name is something like Akashverosh. Akashverosh. So that's how I'm going to be pronouncing it today. And Esther in Hebrew is Hadassah. Hadassah. And then the third major character is Mordecai. Mordecai. And then the fourth character that you need to know about today is Haman. Haman. In English, we usually pronounce his name Haman, but it's pronounced in Hebrew Haman. So this is what we are going to do today. We're going to do what is typically done at Purim. Now, what does Purim even mean? Purim is a plural word. It's the plural of the singular word pure. And pure in Hebrew means lot. Like, lot is not a word that we use much in English, but it's analogous to rolling the dice. Okay, so, if you're going to cast lots, shall we say, to see whose turn it is or to see who's selected to do this, that, and the other, you might roll dice to do that. Or in more modern terms, you might use something called a random number generator on your phone. You might have an app that is a random number generator, and you might use that to use randomness to make choices for you. And casting lots was something that was done a great deal in the ancient Near East, BC. And it even continued on into the time of Solomon's temple and into the time of the Second Temple and even into Yeshua's day, even into the first century CE. It was a big part of temple practice to cast lots. And the reason they did that in the temple was to determine on a daily basis who was going to perform what function. So casting lots wasn't considered gambling. It was basically looked at as a device to carry out the will of God. So the reason the book is called Purim, which means lots, is because in the setting of the story, lots were cast. And for whatever the strange reason, that came to be known as the name of the book. Now, you may be asking, well, who wrote the book of Esther? Well, most of the sages believe it was written by Mordecai with the assistance of Esther. And so almost, you might say, has dual authors. And of course, like just about everything, there's disagreement with that to some point. But most theologians believe it was either totally written by Mordecai or it was written by Mordecai and Esther. So on Purim, what happens? It's generally a night where people who celebrate this story of liberation and deliverance, they get together and they have a big costume party. And what happens is, and I've never gotten the opportunity to do this. I'm hoping one day I'll get invited to a Purim party and I'll get to go and dress up as one of the characters in the story. And sometimes it's done as a masquerade. You know, a masquerade is a costume party where people disguise their real identity. So some do it that way. Some don't make it a masquerade. They just dress up in costumes, and the kids do it, not just the children, but the adults usually do it too. And they have fun. They have food. And what they do is they act out a reenactment of the book of Esther. And y'all, that's what we're going to do today. So if you want to participate, you just choose a character that you want to portray, and you can do this however you want to in your own home there, in the comfort of your own home. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a reenactment of the book of Esther in the form of a play. We're going to go through the whole book. Yes, we are. And I'm going to play all the characters. And let me show you how I'm going to do that. So for each character, I have a particular hat that I'm going to wear. This is a white hat. Now, who usually wears the white hat in a play? It's the hero, right? Or the heroine will be what we might call the white hat. Okay, so who do you think is going to be the white hat if you're familiar with the story? It's going to be Mordecai. All right, so when I'm speaking as Mordecai, I'll have the white hat on. Okay. Okay, and then here is another hat. Here we go. This is a crown, right? Everybody can see this is a crown. All right, and so that it'll make it easy for you. Here is a tiara. Okay, so who do you think is going to be the crown? It's going to be King Ahasuerus. Yes, King Ahasuerus. All right. And this should be easy. Who do you think is going to be the tiara? Well, Queen Esther, of course. And if you're totally unfamiliar with this story, that's okay. I'm glad you're here. That's why you're here, to learn it, right? You're going to get to learn the whole thing. We're going to do a big overview in a fun way. And here is a tri-cornered hat, although it's not exactly cornered very much, is it? It's more like three-segmented hat, you might say. So if you're familiar with the story, you know that Haman is always portrayed by the three-cornered hat. And there's also a narrator in the story. So when I'm playing the part of the narrator, I won't have on a hat at all. Okay, are you ready to go? And there are a lot of these plays that people have adapted from the story that are put on, and you can find them on the internet. This one that I'm going to be adapting, I'm not going to be reading it exactly, but it comes from a site called Shalom-Peace, PEACE.com. And if you want to see it in its actual wording, you can find it there. But like I said, there are many of them, and they're pretty much the same. Okay, here goes the narrator. You ready? Here we go. This is the story of Purim, which is the Jewish feast that is celebrated every year to remember the amazing events that transpired in the kingdom of Persia when Ahasuerus, or I have to look at it every time, Akashverosh, was king. And this was in approximately the 5th century BC. It's an amazing story, not only because it's true, but because there were horrible plans to wipe out every Jewish person in that kingdom. And those plans were given the kibosh, which is a good Yiddish word, by Almighty God, our beloved Father Yahweh. He miraculously intervened in what appeared to be a hopeless situation and accordingly rescued all the Jewish people from certain death. Now, I've already told you about the 4 primary characters in our story, and we're going to begin our story. Okay? Now, it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus, when the king ruled from his throne of his kingdom, which was in the town of Shushan, in the 3rd year of his reign, that he made a feast, and he invited all his princes and his noblemen, the power players of Persia and Media, and they came and they celebrated with him for 180 days. And during that time, he educated them as to the might of the Medo-Persian Empire. He basically schooled them. All right. And at the end of this time, he gave a very lavish 7-day feast, almost like a graduation feast. All right. And everybody was really making merry. And this took place in the court of the king's palace. And so we can see that all was going well until the 7th day of the feast. And on the 7th day of the feast, King Ahasuerus had this idea. It was not a very good idea, but he had this idea that he would call his very beautiful queen to make an appearance before his princes and nobles and their significant others. And he wanted to show off her beauty. So he summoned her. And guess what? She responded with a resounding no. What? What do you mean she said no? What if this deed of the queen should be made known abroad to all the women of my kingdom? And what if, when they see the queen's horrible example, they decide to despise their husbands when they hear of this? Why, the men of my kingdom would never forgive me. There would be turmoil and anarchy and chaos, and we certainly can't have that. The king's counselors, accordingly, advised the king that Queen Vashti had not only insulted the king, but she had disgraced the entire kingdom, all the princes, all the nobles. So their recommendation to the king was that he find himself a new queen. So shall it be. I shall find, select, and marry another gorgeous woman from the vast kingdom of Medo-Persia. It will be someone who dwells in my kingdom at this present time. And I am charging my counselors now to begin this search for the magnificent woman who will be my new wife and queen. Now, in the palace of Shushan, there was a Jewish man named Mordecai. He was of the tribe of Benjamin. And he had been carried away from Jerusalem in the Babylonian captivity. So he was not a spring chicken, okay? Because remember, by this time, the Babylonian captivity had taken place over 70 years before. So he must have been carried out when he was very, very young. He may have even been in utero at that time. We don't really know. But at any rate, Mordecai had a first cousin, and she was his uncle's daughter, and her name was Hadassah, or in English, Esther. Now, Hadassah was extremely fair, very beautiful. And there were many women who were brought to the palace for this competition, you might say, so that Ahasuerus could choose a new wife and queen. Now, Esther, listen to your old cousin Mordecai. You need to be careful as you enter this contest because most of these people are not friendly to our people, the Jews. You need to be sure that you don't tell anyone that you are a Jew, that you are a descendant and heir of the promises of Abraham. Keep it quiet. So the scriptures tell us that, lo and behold, the king loved Esther above all the other women, that she obtained favor and grace in his sight, and even more than all the other virgins. So he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. But in the midst of all this joy, there was treachery and deceit brewing within the kingdom. There were people, 2 individuals, who were plotting to kill King Ahasuerus, to assassinate him. Fortunately, Mordecai, who was one of the king's highest advisors, found out about this plan, and he put a stop to it. He put the kibosh, shall we say again, on it, and he saved the king's life. But you know what? Somehow, even though the criminals were caught and hanged on a tree, it didn't come to the king's attention that Mordecai had done this. And Mordecai was an humble man, so he didn't toot his own horn. But God allowed this near tragedy to occur in order to prevent a much greater tragedy in the Persian kingdom. Now, for a reason that we are not told in Scripture, King Ahasuerus brought honor and advancement also, not only to Mordecai, but also to a prince named Haman the Agagite. Now Haman, was not a Jew. He was not a Jew. He was an Agagite, which is a branch of the Amalekites, okay? Or in Hebrew, we call them the Amalki. He was an Amalekite, an Agagite. I have trouble with that word. But the king promoted Haman to be like his second in command in the kingdom. He was way up there. And all of the king's servants bowed to Haman and revered him, except one of the king's highest noblemen. And guess who that was? You got it. Mordecai. I'm going to get that Mordecai and all his fellow Jews, those nasty people throughout the kingdom of Persia. But then what would be the right time to destroy this people? I know. I'll have the king's servants who are loyal to me cast lots, and they will do this every day until it is revealed the right time for me to know when to exterminate these Jews. So Haman had his servants cast lots before him every day, and eventually a month was settled on, the month of Adar, and Haman determined that he should do this diabolical deed in the month of Adar. Now, Haman, are you saying to me that there is a subculture of people in my kingdom called the Jews that are scattered among the people of my kingdom, and you're telling me that they don't keep my laws and that I should allow you to wipe them out, and that 10,000 talents should be paid to the people who would do this thing? Well, fine, but go ahead and do it. But here, take my ring so that you may carry out these things without any hindrance. So Haman had a terrible decree written, and he sealed it with the king's ring. And the decree basically said that all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, should be destroyed, that they should be killed, that they should perish, all in one day during the month of Adar, and that their possessions should be taken away and redistributed among the other Persians, and that all able-bodied non-Jewish Persians should be prepared to attack the Jews on that day. Well, when Mordecai heard about this, naturally, he was extremely distressed, and in the common images of showing distress of that day, he tore his clothes and he put on itchy sackcloth, and he rubbed ashes from the fireplace all over his skin, and he went out into the middle of the city, and he cried with a loud and bitter cry. Yet in every province, wherever the king's command was spread abroad, there was great mourning among the Jews. They could see the handwriting on the wall. They began to fast and to weep and to wail. Many of them likewise put on sackcloth and ashes. And Esther, when she got wind of it, she sent a message to Mordecai and said, basically, what the heck? What are we going to do about this? What are we supposed to do about this, Mordecai? What in the world can be done to save our people? The ox is in the ditch here, cousin. Something has to be done. Otherwise, we are going to perish, our entire people. What can possibly be done? Oh, messenger, listen to me. Go back to her and tell her this. Go in for an audience with the king, bow down before him and make supplication to him, beg him for your people, that he would spare our lives, and go do this quickly. What kind of message is this, messenger? Go back to my cousin Mordecai and tell him that everyone knows that a person can't just, of their own volition, go in before the king. It is a very risky move. If anyone, even I, the queen, were to come before the king in his inner court without having been called or summoned, I could be put to death for that. And that's according to the law of King Ahasuerus. The only hope that I would have in that situation would be if the king were to extend to me his golden scepter. I almost said sepulcher. That would be a misnomer. his golden scepter. And if he were to do that and I were to touch the end of the golden scepter, then I would be granted the ability to speak. But I've not been summoned before the king in the last 30 days. What if he doesn't want to see me yet? Messenger, return to your queen and tell her the following words. Don't think that you are going to escape this just because you are the queen and just because you dwell in the king's house. You are a Jew. And if you hold your peace at this time, if you don't take this step, which I've recommended to you, then God will deliver his people. He will be faithful to his people. Deliverance will arise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's house shall be destroyed. Who knows whether or not you are come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Famous words. For such a time as this. Messenger, go and say this to my cousin Mordecai. Mordecai, go and gather all the Jews together that are in Shushan and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will likewise fast. And so will I go before the king unsummoned, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Now it came to pass after 3 days of fasting that Esther put on her best, most beautiful royal apparel, and she went to stand in the inner court of the king's house. And the king sat upon his royal throne, and he saw her standing over in the inner court. And God gave her favor in his sight. So the king held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand, and Esther drew near and touched the top of the scepter. Well, 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 to what do I owe the extreme pleasure of seeing my beautiful queen? What a delightful surprise. Ask of me whatever you like, and I will even give it to you, even if it's half of my kingdom, if you desire it. Please, my king, my request is that you and Haman would come to a banquet that I have prepared for the two of you today. So the king agreed, and he and Haman came to the banquet that Esther had prepared. And the king promised again to give Esther anything she desired, even if it were to half of his kingdom. O great king, my petition is this. If I have found favor in your sight, again, would you please come to another banquet, which I will prepare for you and Haman tomorrow? And at that time, I will state my petition. So the king agreed, and Haman went home extremely joyful and glad in his heart, because he was not only invited to one banquet that the queen had prepared, he was invited to a second banquet the very next day. So he was practically skipping and hopping all the way home. But as he passed by Mordecai sitting in the king's gate, he allowed Mordecai to steal his joy, because Mordecai would not stand up or bow or honor Haman in any way. So Haman decided that that was the straw that broke the camel's back. I have had it with that Mordecai. I'm not even going to wait before I begin the destruction of this Jewish people. In fact, I'm going to start with this dreaded Mordecai. I'm going to have a gallows 75 feet high built, and tomorrow morning, I'm going to request an audience with the king and ask that Mordecai be hanged on those gallows. Well, that night, strangely enough, the king was unable to sleep. He had insomnia. And so, in an effort to help himself get sleepy, he didn't count sheep. He requested that his courtiers bring him the book of the records of the chronicles of the kingdom and read them out loud to him. I guess it would be, kind of like if we had a book from the tax office and we just went down the line reading who paid how much tax on how much acres. Apparently, it was dreadfully boring. Okay. So in the reading, the king heard and was reminded of that incident where Mordecai saved the king's life by revealing that plot against him. And thus the king proclaimed, "What honor and dignity has been done to Mordecai for this? Nothing? You must be kidding me. This man saved my life and nothing was done for him? Well, this needs to be rectified immediately. Who is in attendance in my outer court? Haman? Haman? Call him in." Now, the reason that Haman was in the outer court was because Haman couldn't sleep either, because all night long his mind was turning and churning over what he wanted to do to Mordecai. So he had come to the king's outer court in the wee hours of the morning, in the dead of night, because he couldn't get it off his mind. But before Haman could mention this to the king said to him, "Haman, what shall be done unto the man that the king wants to honor for outstanding service to the kingdom?" Now, for Haman's part, Haman thought that he was the man that the king wanted to honor, because if you haven't figured it out yet, Haman was a supreme megalomaniac. He was the ultimate egotist. He was so full of himself, you couldn't put one more drop of ego into the top of his head. So, listen to what Haman said. "For the man that the king delights to honor, let royal apparel, the king's favorite royal apparel, be brought, and the king's favorite horse, let that horse be brought too, the one that the king loves to ride, and a royal crown, and then have one of the king's most noble princes bring all that to the man that the king would like to honor, and have that man that's being honored ride on horseback through the street, dressed in the king's apparel, with the king's crown on his head, and have that nobleman proclaim before the man, quote, 'Thus shall it be done for the man whom the king delights to honor.'" And the king responded, "Haman, such a delightful idea. Quickly, I'm charging you to go and do exactly as you have said. The man I wish to honor is Mordecai the Jew." Well, you can imagine Haman's consternation, to say the least. But he was forced to do exactly what the king had said and to bring honor to Mordecai the Jew. But afterwards, Mordecai in humility just returned to the king's gate, ever concerned about the plight of his people. And Haman returned home mourning, having his head covered. There wasn't much that could be more humiliating to Haman than that. And when he got home, Zeresh, his wife, and all of Haman's wise men counseled him that they uh, that Haman needed to just drop it with Mordecai. They said, "Leave that man alone. You are not going to prevail against him. Look how the king has honored him. You might as well just get over it. Okay, take a pill, chill out, get over it." And about that time, the king's servants came to take Haman to the king's house for the banquet. Banquet number 2. Now, the king and Haman came to the banquet of Esther the queen, and the king again said to Esther on the occasion of this second banquet, "What is your petition, Queen Esther? Please tell me. It would be my greatest heart's delight to grant your petition, even if what you ask is for half of my kingdom." O great and mighty king, if I have found favor in your sight, and if it please you, I ask you to spare my life and the life of my people, because we have been sold, I and my people, and slated for destruction, to be slain, to have our possessions seized, to be thoroughly wiped out from the kingdom of Persia. Who is this that has dared and presumed in his heart to do such a wicked thing? The adversary and enemy is that wicked Haman. Well, naturally, Haman became exceedingly afraid in the presence of the king and queen. The king was so angry that he got up from the banquet table in great wrath and went out into the palace garden to calm himself. Haman was so frightened that he very unwisely threw himself upon the chaise lounge, you might say, where the queen was lying at banquet, because in that culture of the ancient Near East, they would lean on a side and they would prop themselves up on with one of their arms and shoulders, and they would eat with their other hand. So she was still reclining on the chaise lounge. But he throws himself upon the chaise lounge and starts begging for his life. And that's what he's doing when the king walks back in and sees Haman lying there practically on top of his queen. And he says, "Will he force himself upon my queen, even right before my very eyes in my own palace?" Now, when the king said that, the king's servants rushed over and covered Haman's head. And they informed the king, because they'd gotten wind of it, that Haman had built a gallows 75 feet high, on which Haman had ordered to have Mordecai the Jew hung. And the king said, "Hang Haman on those very gallows." So Haman was hanged on the gallows that he had constructed in his own house to kill Mordecai. And on that day, the king gave the entire house of Haman, the Jew's enemy, to Esther the queen. He took off his ring, which he had taken from Haman, and he gave it to Mordecai. And Queen Esther spoke yet again, fell down at his feet, and struggled with tears, beseeching him that he would stop the terrible things that Haman the Agagite had determined to do to the Jewish people. "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in your sight, and this thing seem right before the king, and I be pleasing in your eyes, let it be written to reverse the commandments, the evil commandments that were devised by Haman to destroy the Jews who are all through the king's provinces and who are good, loyal citizens. How can I endure to see the evil that shall come upon my people? How can I survive seeing the destruction of my kindred, O king? Behold, I, the king, grant that you and your cousin Mordecai may write letters in the king's name, and I will seal them with my royal seal. For if anything is written in my name and sealed with my seal, it can only be reversed with another edict. That's the only way it can be reversed. So I can't cancel the one that Haman did until I write another one and publish it abroad. So Mordecai got busy, and he commanded unto the Jews and to the lieutenants and to the deputies and the rulers of the provinces from India all the way to Ethiopia, 127 provinces to be exact, and to every people group in their own language, a letter in the king's name with the king's seal. And that letter, those commands, freed the Jewish people from the edicts that Haman had published. It granted the Jews permission to destroy and to slay, to cause to perish all of their enemies who had formerly plotted and planned to destroy them. And the 13th day of the 12th month, in the month of Adar, was decreed as the day in which this should take place. The Jews should be ready on that day to avenge themselves against those who would have oppressed and killed them. And when these commands were published all through the kingdom, the Jews had light and gladness and joy. And many of the people of the lands became Jews. They converted for fear of what would happen to the enemies of the Jews. So that day came, the 13th day of the 12th month, the day when the decrees were drawing near. The Jews gathered themselves together in their cities in all the provinces of Persia, and all the rulers of the provinces helped the Jews because the fear of God had fallen upon them, because Mordecai became greater and greater in the king's house, and his fame had gone out to all the provinces. And the Jews on that day smote all of their enemies who had sought to destroy them. And the king said unto Esther, the Jews have slain and destroyed 500 men in Shushan. But what about the 10 sons of Haman? And what about the rest of my provinces? What is thy petition, and shall it be granted thee? What is thy further request, and it shall be done? If it please the king, let it be granted to the Jews which are in Shushan to do tomorrow also, according as unto this day's decree, and let Haman's 10 sons be hanged upon the gallows. And the king said, make it so. So the 10 sons of Haman were hanged on the same gallows that their father was hanged upon. So the Jews that were in Shushan on the 14th day of Adar, they gathered together and they slew 300 men at Shushan, but they did not take possessions for booty. The other Jews that were in the provinces gathered themselves together and stood for their lives and had rest from their enemies. And they also did not take possessions as booty, but they ended up slaying about 75,000 people. So after these battles, they rested and they made a feast day of gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the villages that dwelt in the unwalled towns, they made the 14th day of Adar a day of gladness, of feasting, a good day, a day of sending gifts to one another, a day for helping the poor. And Mordecai wrote letters commanding that the Jews establish this day among themselves to keep the 14th day of Adar and the 15th day as feast days every year, because it was a month that was turned from joy to sorrow for the Jews and from mourning into a good day, a day of feasting and sending portions and helping the poor. And these 2 days, the 14th and 15th of Adar, are called Purim because Haman cast the lots, he cast the Purim in order to try to destroy the Jews. But this day was not ordained as a feast day for the Jews only, because as it says in the Holy Scriptures, this day was ordained as a feast day for all the Jews and for all the people who joined themselves to them, for Jewish and Gentile people who love God's people. And you know, when we accept Yeshua as our Messiah, we join ourselves to Israel. We then move from being part of the pagan world to being part of God's people. We become part of Israel. And so, just like we are able to keep all the other feast days, all the other Moedim, you know, we have Sukkot coming up this week, toward the end of the week. And I'm looking forward to celebrating that particular feast day, the season of our joy, my favorite name for Sukkot. But anyone who has joined himself to Israel through Yeshua, the Messiah, through Jesus, the Christ, then you can celebrate Purim as well as the other feast days. So, in conclusion, King Ahasuerus declared the greatness of Mordecai. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to the king himself and great among the Jews, and accepted the multitude of his brethren, seeking the wealth of Mordecai's people, and speaking shalom, speaking peace to all his seed. You know, can you think of someone who in the kingdom of the Babylonians rose to be second in command to the king? Do you remember who that was? That was the prophet Daniel. Daniel was hauled off in the Babylonian captivity as a teenager. And Daniel lived the 70 years of captivity in Babylon. And in fact, Daniel was still alive when the Medes and the Persians took over. So I don't know how long he lived after that, but he saw the Medes and the Persians take over, and it's entirely possible that he lived to see the end of the captivity. It's entirely possible that he lived all 70 years and he got to see people return to Judah. So, you know, the reason I mentioned Daniel is that, you know, he was in second command in Babylon, and Mordecai, another Jew, was second in command during the reign of Ahasuerus. So, you know, I mentioned that to make the point that no matter where the Jewish people have been, where they have lived, they are the cream that rises to the top. They never fail to excel in business, in industry, in invention, in sciences, in arts, in letters. If you were to go on the internet and you were to Google famous Jews, let's just say, you might see names of people that you didn't even know they were Jewish. But no matter where they have lived, no matter what country, they have contributed positively to make that a better place. You know, I don't have much time this morning. I'm about out of time, but this morning earlier here at my home, I was sitting watching something frivolous on television, and an ad came on the television, and it was touting a website. The satanic celebration of Halloween is approaching, and there was an advertisement for a website called gotvoodoo.com. And the ad itself was just full of witchcraft, of paganism. And it just struck me so hard to see what we have become. The influence of the God of the Bible, and it's the same God. Yahweh is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Yeshua is the same today, yesterday, and forever. Same God. He changes not. But the one true God, hear, O Israel, our God, he is one. The one true God. This country has forsaken him, and we need to be in deep prayer for our country because things are dire in this country. We have left the God of the Bible. We've forsaken the commandments of Scripture. We have forsaken them, and things are dire. So as we continue on in this holy season, let's celebrate the Moedim. Let's celebrate Sukkot starting this Friday night. Let's celebrate Shemini Atzeret at the end of the week, and let's celebrate Simchat Torah on October the 8th. And I wish all of you a season of joy and happiness and rejoicing. You know, our Savior, Yeshua, our Savior, Jesus, he celebrated the Jewish feasts. There's a passage in John where he was in the temple celebrating Sukkot. The occasion was at the end of the festival, the last great day of the festival during the ceremony of water pouring. So, you know, if Sukkot was good enough for my Savior, it's good enough for me, right? Well, thank you for being here today and starting the book of Esther with me. I do plan to teach next Wednesday. I don't see that changing, and I look forward to getting started with you in this book. I hope you've enjoyed this joyful rendition of how it would be celebrated actually on Purim. And I will look forward to then just seeing you next week. And until then, Chag Sukkot Sameach and Shalom Shalom Lahitraot.
We are richly blessed to bring you what we believe is the fullest, most diverse, yet up-to-date progressive teachings, discussion, and prayer programming you can find anywhere on this planet. Be sure to take the tour of the MessianicLambRadio.com website. I'm Susan Hugie, thanking you for joining us on the Messianic Lamb Video Network.